The hall doesn't feel loud. It never does. Places built on tradition rarely are. People arrive dressed the way respect usually looks: pressed jackets, calm confidence, familiar faces greeting each other with small nods. This is a space where expectations are already decided before anything begins. You can almost feel it in the air, the assumption that whatever happens tonight will follow a certain pattern. Orderly, predictable, correct. Then someone walks in who doesn't quite match that picture. Nothing about him is disruptive. He isn't late. He isn't noisy. He doesn't draw attention to himself. In fact, he seems to be doing the opposite. Choosing a seat away from the spotlight, keeping his head down, blending into the background. If you didn't know better, you might assume he was just another guest who wandered in by accident. And that's the point. Most judgments don't arrive loudly. They happen quietly. Instantly, without words. A glance here, a pause there, a subtle recalibration of where someone belongs in the invisible hierarchy of the room. No one says anything out loud, but the conclusion is already formed. This is a place that values progress you can measure: years of training, clear milestones, recognized paths. You don't earn respect here by surprising people. You earn it by proving over time that you followed the rules correctly. So when someone doesn't look like the result of that process, the mind fills in the gaps. Probably a guest. Probably not important. Probably here to observe, not to contribute. And the interesting thing is, that assumption feels reasonable. Logical even. Because we're taught over and over that success announces itself early. That if something matters, it will look impressive right away. That value shows up fast and clearly. But real growth rarely works like that. Sometimes progress looks messy. Sometimes it looks unfinished. Sometimes it looks like someone sitting quietly, while everyone else assumes they already understand the whole story. Do you think most people underestimate slow progress or overestimate quick wins? And why? That question sits beneath moments like this, whether anyone notices it or not, because what's about to unfold isn't loud. It isn't sudden. It doesn't start with a revelation. It starts with patience. And with everyone in the room being very sure they already know what matters. Until they don't. Do we overestimate quick wins or underestimate slow progress? Nothing dramatic happens at first, and that's important. The story doesn't move forward because of an argument or a confrontation. It moves forward because people start interpreting the same situation in different ways. The setting stays calm. The order remains intact. On the surface, everything feels controlled. But beneath that calm, expectations are forming. A conversation begins, not hostile, not rude, polite even. One side speaks from certainty, from years of experience, from a system that rewards structure and repetition. The words sound reasonable. Measured. They carry the weight of tradition. The kind of confidence that doesn't need to raise its voice because it assumes it's already right. The other side doesn't push back. And that silence is misread. Silence often is. Instead of resistance, it's interpreted as agreement, or lack of depth, or simply not knowing enough to respond. The imbalance grows, not because one side attacks, but because the other side refuses to perform. This is where the tension quietly builds. Each new moment adds a layer of meaning, not information. A performance is technically impressive, clean, precise, exactly what is expected. The kind of excellence that confirms the system works. Heads nod, internal check marks are made. Everything feels justified, yet something feels incomplete. Not wrong, just distant. The story escalates by contrast. What's being praised versus what's being felt. What's being measured versus what's being experienced. No one points this out directly. The viewer senses it through pauses, through restrained reactions, through the absence of visible excitement, where excitement is supposed to exist. Then perspective shifts again. Another performance enters the scene, and this time the reaction is different. Not because it breaks rules, but because it reveals something human underneath the structure. Emotion leaks through. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but honestly. And suddenly the earlier certainty feels thinner. The authority figure interprets this moment through the same lens as before: discipline, training, effort. The explanation stays consistent, but the meaning has changed for the viewer. The audience understands something before the authority does. That's where real tension lies. Not in conflict, but in misalignment. The story keeps escalating by letting one character stay ahead emotionally while another stays behind intellectually. The gap widens. Every confident statement feels heavier now, not because it's wrong, but because it's incomplete. And this is where the core idea quietly surfaces. Progress doesn't always look impressive while it's happening. Sometimes it looks ordinary. Sometimes it looks out of place. Sometimes it looks like someone who doesn't need to prove anything anymore. But systems often reward what grows fast, not what grows deep. Do you think most people underestimate slow progress or overestimate quick wins? And why? That question sits at the center of this structure, because everything unfolding here depends on timing, on who gets recognized early and who gets understood later, on how easily we confuse polish with depth. The escalation continues without raising volume. Recognition hasn't happened yet, but it's getting closer. The audience feels it approaching. They know the meaning of the room is about to shift, even if the people inside it don't. That's the engine of this narrative. Not surprise, but inevitability. The story doesn't rush toward its turning point. It lets interpretation do the work. It allows the viewer to arrive at the conclusion emotionally before it ever arrives structurally. And when the shift finally happens, it won't feel shocking. It will feel overdue. Have you learned something just by observing quietly? The room has settled into its rhythm. Every sound, every movement, every glance is measured against a quiet standard. The audience sits, the performers play, the authority observes, and the protagonist remains mostly invisible. It's easy to assume that nothing unusual is happening. On the surface, everything is technically perfect. Each note lands where it should. Each movement follows the expected choreography of excellence. No mistakes, no uncertainty, no surprise. Just skill, just polish, and yet, there's something almost imperceptible that refuses to settle. The protagonist watches, quietly, patiently. Not to judge, not to compare, but to feel. To notice what the mechanics cannot express. The tension in the room isn't loud. It isn't marked by words. It's subtle. Felt in a breath held too long, in a pause before applause, in the almost imperceptible shifts of attention. The authority figure nods approvingly at the precision, the technical mastery, the flawless execution. He's confident, almost proud. This is exactly what he expected. The system works. Excellence has its reward. Everything is as it should be. But the audience, those who are watching closely, feels the difference. Not what is wrong, but what is missing. Emotion, connection, depth. That unquantifiable element that turns performance into something that touches the heart. The protagonist doesn't interrupt. He doesn't clap louder. He doesn't react theatrically. Instead, he leans in slightly, noticing the small nuances, the way a hand hesitates over a key, the slight quiver in a breath, the way someone's eyes linger on a particular phrase, as if it's speaking directly to them. This is the point where the narrative shifts, not because anything dramatic happens, but because meaning begins to diverge. The authority sees perfection, the protagonist sees the story behind it, and the audience, if paying attention, begins to feel it too. It's subtle, almost invisible, and yet it's the core of why this moment matters. Then comes the moment that breaks the quiet. A small misstep, not in skill, not in discipline, but in certainty. A pause, an unexpected accent, a note held too long or too soft. Nothing objectively wrong, but enough to feel real, enough to remind everyone that perfection is only one layer of what art can be. The authority notices this imperfection first. He frowns, not harshly, not angrily, but with a subtle confusion. This is unfamiliar territory. He is trained to see the technical. He is not trained to feel the story behind the music. And yet, he senses that the room has shifted in ways he cannot name. The protagonist smiles faintly, a quiet acknowledgement. The story is not about control. It is not about winning approval. It is about honesty. About letting the moment exist fully, without polishing it, without forcing it to meet expectation. The audience begins to sense this. You can almost see it in their posture, in the subtle lean forward, the held breath, the soft exhale after a phrase lingers. People are emotionally investing, and the room feels heavier with meaning than with skill alone. At this midpoint, reflection is inevitable. The question arises naturally, almost silently. Do you think most people underestimate slow progress or overestimate quick wins, and why? It doesn't interrupt the story. It doesn't demand an answer. It floats in the space between observation and realization. The question frames everything, because what is happening is slow, subtle, and cumulative. It's the kind of growth that doesn't announce itself with flash or noise. And yet, when it is noticed, it feels profound. Slow progress is invisible until it becomes undeniable. Quick wins are celebrated long before their meaning is tested. The narrative thrives on this tension. The audience begins to consider their own experiences, their own assumptions, and their own impatience for visible results. The protagonist continues to observe, continues to wait. The authority, increasingly aware of the mismatch between perception and reality, starts to soften, to question, to reconsider. Not loudly, not dramatically, but subtly, internally. The story moves forward because people are now interpreting, not merely observing. The tension escalates naturally. Stakes are emotional. Trust builds quietly as viewers begin aligning with the protagonist's perspective. Alignment isn't forced, it emerges from empathy and patience. Every subsequent action is amplified by this reflection. Each note, each gesture, each interaction carries weight beyond its surface execution. The audience's mind is now active, emotionally engaged, and questioning not only the narrative but their own assumptions. This is the midpoint where the story transforms. It is no longer a tale of skill, but a tale of meaning. And it is in this space that viewers become fully invested. Because they are not being told what to think, they are invited to feel, to notice, and to reflect. From here, the narrative is ready to escalate toward the reveal. But it does so knowing the audience is already part of the story, thinking in parallel, emotionally present, quietly anticipating what comes next. The lights in the room have dimmed, but the tension hasn't gone away. It lingers quietly, like a held breath, stretching across the rows of observers who think they already understand what is happening. Everything has been predictable so far. Each performance technically perfect, each gesture measured, each note landing exactly where it should. The authority figure nods, satisfied. He believes the story has been told, the hierarchy confirmed, the outcome inevitable. But the protagonist sees differently. Not in the way others are trained to see, not through a checklist of achievement or discipline. He sees what isn't being said, what isn't being measured, and what cannot be contained in rules or rubrics. A single performance begins, and suddenly, the room's energy shifts. It's subtle at first, almost imperceptible. The audience leans forward. The authority glances up, curious but guarded. The protagonist's eyes soften. He notices the nuance, the hesitation in a hand, the tremor in a breath, the emotion beneath the mechanics. It is imperfect, uneven, human. And it matters. What happens next is not a correction of skill, it is a revelation of presence. Every note, every pause, every slight imperfection conveys depth. It tells a story of struggle, loss, hope, and endurance. And while the authority still praises the measurable, those who watch carefully sense the difference. Something real has arrived in the space between the notes. The protagonist doesn't speak. He doesn't clap early. He doesn't force attention. He simply observes, quietly acknowledging the humanity in what is unfolding. The contrast between what is expected and what is experienced grows. That quiet tension, nurtured throughout the narrative, begins to bloom into awareness. The authority notices, slowly, subtly, confusion first, then curiosity. He begins to realize that the rules and metrics that guided his judgment aren't capturing everything of value. What seemed perfect was incomplete. What seemed controlled was missing truth. And the deeper understanding isn't measured in technical proficiency, but in emotional resonance. At this point, the story invites reflection, not as a lecture, but as a question that sits in the mind of every attentive observer. Do you think most people underestimate slow progress or overestimate quick wins? And why? The question doesn't interrupt the flow. It doesn't demand a verbal answer. It floats in the shared consciousness of the room. The audience begins to engage internally, drawing parallels to their own lives. They notice where they have judged others too quickly, celebrated speed over depth, or overlooked the quiet accumulation of skill and character. The protagonist leans back slightly, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. He has learned patience over decades. He knows that revelation does not need to be announced. It arrives when observers are ready to notice, when they see meaning beyond the visible, when judgment yields to understanding. As the performance continues, the emotional intensity grows. The authority, once rigid and unwavering, begins to shift. He cannot fully articulate why the room feels different, but he recognizes that something significant has occurred. The observers who had been silently questioning are now fully present. They feel the weight of subtle mastery combined with authentic human expression. This is the pivot of the story. The narrative no longer relies on explicit conflict or dramatic interruption. Instead, it escalates through perception. What matters is no longer technical skill alone. It is insight, empathy, and emotional resonance. The audience's alignment with the protagonist's perspective strengthens organically, creating a shared understanding that the authority has yet to fully grasp. By the time the performance ends, the room is silent, not from protocol but from awe. The slow, cumulative impact of the protagonist's presence, and the subtle brilliance of what has been played leaves everyone contemplating meaning beyond measurable achievement. The authority's initial certainty is now tempered with humility. The audience is engaged emotionally and intellectually, reflecting on their own assumptions. The reveal does not require applause to validate it. It exists in the quiet transformation of perception, the recognition that mastery is not only technique but also depth, patience, and authenticity. And in that recognition, the story has achieved its purpose to show that value is often hidden, cumulative, and overlooked until attention and empathy allow it to be seen. The room is buzzing now, but not loudly. It is a quiet hum, a subtle vibration that signals that something has shifted. Not the space itself, but perception, the walls, the rows, the carefully arranged stage, they are unchanged. But everyone watching feels differently. What once seemed ordinary now carries weight. What once seemed predictable now feels surprising. And the authority figure, confident and measured just moments ago, notices the shift before he can name it. There is hesitation in his posture, a subtle lowering of the eyes, a recognition that his assumptions may have been incomplete. The protagonist, who has sat silently through observation after observation, now steps forward, not to dominate, not to perform, but simply to exist fully in the space. His presence is quiet, unassuming, and yet it carries authority that no title can confer. It is not earned through ceremony or rehearsal. It is earned through experience, patience, and empathy. Observers begin to lean in, not because they are instructed, but because the atmosphere has changed. Attention has turned inward, reflecting back on their own expectations. They sense the reversal. The person who had seemed irrelevant or underestimated is now the focal point, the source of insight and meaning. Recognition comes in pieces. A glance here, a whisper there, small gestures ripple through the audience. Suddenly, what was invisible becomes undeniable. Everyone realizes that the assumptions formed at the start of the evening, about who belongs, who matters, who possesses value, were incomplete. The reversal is subtle, but complete. Status and respect are no longer about titles, but about presence, contribution, and authenticity. The protagonist does not need to explain this aloud. The audience perceives it organically through observation, through reaction, through the quiet unfolding of truth. Human connection has replaced judgment, authenticity has replaced performance, and in that quiet, transformative moment, every observer is invited to reflect on their own preconceptions. It is here, in this liminal space between perception and understanding, that the engagement question emerges naturally. How often do you think we underestimate people based on surface details? It is not posed as a challenge. It is not seeking verification. It is offered as a lens through which the audience may examine their own experiences. It floats gently within the narrative, giving the audience room to reflect. Some will nod silently. Some will recall moments when they misjudged someone. Some will consider how often they have assumed quick wins were meaningful and overlooked slow, steady growth. The beauty of this moment is that it is shared yet personal. Each viewer interprets it through their own lens. No one is told what to think or feel. The question invites introspection and dialogue, not argument. It is neutral, open-ended, and policy-safe, making it ideal for engagement without controversy. Meanwhile, the reversal continues subtly. The authority figure begins to soften, acknowledging the value he had failed to see earlier. His expressions shift from confidence to curiosity, from certainty to reflection. The audience senses this evolution and feels validated in their observation, strengthening emotional investment. The protagonist and the emerging performers are now aligned in purpose, even if the audience and authority are only beginning to recognize it. Emotional tension that has built quietly over the previous sections now releases through recognition, connection, and the shared human understanding that meaning is not always immediately visible. This is the essence of the core narrative principle. Perception shapes reality until observation, patience, and empathy reveal the depth that was always present. And it is precisely in moments like this, quiet but resonant, that engagement questions become meaningful, giving the audience a chance to internalize and participate in the story without disrupting its flow. The lights begin to rise slowly, but the room is not yet ready to move. The applause has faded into a quiet hum, a shared acknowledgement that something significant has happened, not a spectacle, not a show, but a subtle transformation of perception and understanding. Everyone is standing now not because it is required, but because the meaning of the moment compels it. Those who had been seated, confident in their judgments, now look around and see the truth reflected in others' eyes. Respect has shifted quietly, not through force, but through experience. The protagonist steps back, allowing the space to breathe. There is no need for grand gestures, no need for words to explain what was already felt. Presence alone has conveyed more than any speech ever could. Every glance, every subtle movement, carries the story of patience, observation, and authenticity. The authority figure approaches slowly, the weight of his prior assumptions clear in his posture. He does not speak at first. He simply observes. Then, carefully, he begins to acknowledge what he had overlooked: the quiet value, the human depth, the resonance that exists beyond measurable skill. Humility does not come easily, but it arrives naturally when truth cannot be ignored. The room's energy remains alive, gentle but charged. Observers whisper softly to one another, sharing insights without judgment, reflecting on what they have seen. The protagonist smiles faintly, not for recognition, but because the story has fulfilled its purpose. Understanding has taken root. Perspective has shifted, and in this reflective quiet, the narrative invites the audience to engage, not with facts, but with thought. Do you think art and skill always reveal their true value immediately, or does meaning often emerge slowly over time? It is not an interrogation, it is a gentle prompt, a nudge for reflection. The question floats naturally in the space, giving each viewer room to consider their own experiences. Some may think of moments when slow effort was overlooked. Others may recognize times when flashy results were overvalued. It is personal, open-ended, and neutral. No debate is required, no verification demanded. The engagement comes from perspective, not correctness. The protagonist begins to exit the stage area slowly, allowing others to follow their own movement through the space. Observers continue to reflect, carrying the story beyond the walls of the room. The authority lingers for a moment, taking in the subtle aftermath. The shift has been quiet, but undeniable. In these moments, it becomes clear what matters is not always what is visible at first glance. The small, cumulative acts, the patient persistence, the authentic presence, they create impact long before it can be measured. And when recognition finally arrives, it resonates more deeply precisely because it was earned quietly and organically. The audience leaves, some still talking, some still silent, but all carrying the reflection forward. Each person now has an opportunity to reinterpret their own judgments, reconsider assumptions, and value depth over immediate display. The narrative has invited them into a human experience, one where learning is internal, not instructed, and where the emotional takeaway is as important as the observable outcome. Finally, as the room empties, a calm remains. A story completed, not through spectacle, but through careful construction of perception, tension, and human connection. The narrative closes with the understanding that meaning often grows quietly, and those who take the time to notice it gain something enduring. Do you think art needs rules, or does it create its own? This question encourages viewers to consider their own values and beliefs without judgment. It invites reflection, not verification. It is neutral, open-ended, and safe for any community discussion. It ties naturally to the narrative's theme. Meaning emerges through presence, patience, and authentic engagement rather than formulaic measurement. The reflective exit leaves the audience with a sense of completion and personal takeaway. It does not instruct. It does not moralize. It simply allows the emotional arc to resonate and the questions to linger. The room is quiet now, but not empty. Not yet. The performers have finished. The last notes hang in the air, fading slowly like breath leaving a body. Yet the silence is not absence, it is full. Full of weight, reflection, and presence. People begin to shift in their seats, adjusting jackets, brushing hair back, but their eyes remain attentive. Something has changed, though it cannot yet be fully named. It is in the way they glance at one another, the way shoulders relax, the subtle nods of understanding exchanged across the room. The authority figure, who had been confident, measured, and unshakable throughout the evening, sits back and exhales. He looks not at the notes or the technique, but at the effect those notes have had, the emotional resonance that cannot be captured in a rubric or a score. There is humility here, not performative, but genuine. He has seen the unmeasured, the unexpected, and it has shifted something inside him. The protagonist rises slowly, deliberately, not as a performance, but as acknowledgement. No spotlight, no grand gesture, just presence. Every step forward is quiet, measured, and meaningful. Those watching lean in slightly, sensing the significance of a moment that is more about reflection than applause. And in that quiet, the narrative invites the audience to think, not about correctness or facts, but about perspective. Do you think art needs rules, or does it create its own? The question does not interrupt the story. It rests gently in the space between the audience's observation and their internal reflection. It is neutral, open-ended, safe. Each viewer considers it through their own lens, some recalling personal experiences, others reconsidering assumptions about mastery, skill, and value. It encourages thought, not debate, and engagement without controversy. People begin to rise and leave, some lingering a moment longer to glance back at the stage. The protagonist does not rush. He allows each observer to carry the weight of the evening at their own pace. The impact is cumulative, subtle, and enduring, not immediate or sensational. This is the essence of reflective exit. It does not rely on dramatic closure. It relies on resonance, on the internalization of the story, on the awareness that meaning can be slow, subtle, and quietly transformative. The audience leaves with more than the memory of a performance. They leave with questions, impressions, and reflections that extend beyond the room. The authority figure stands as well, a little slower now, absorbing the finality of the moment. He does not speak immediately. There is nothing left to say aloud. The realization itself is enough, that excellence and authenticity are not always measured by appearance, that patience and observation reveal truths that rules alone cannot define. Outside, the hall empties. Conversations begin soft and tentative. People compare their observations, share subtle insights, and reflect on the unspoken lessons they witnessed. And somewhere between leaving and remembering, the narrative continues to live because reflection is not bound by walls, and understanding is not limited to the stage. The protagonist steps into the corridor, unhurried. The evening is over for him, but not for those who watched. The story, carefully constructed through quiet contrasts, cumulative tension, and subtle perspective shifts, has reached its reflective exit. The audience carries it with them. It lingers. It provokes thought. It invites empathy. And in that lingering, the true lesson emerges, the value of patience, presence, and authenticity. The impact of what is observed slowly, rather than celebrated quickly.